All right, today we're jumping into a really interesting modern framework for interpreting scripture. We're going to explore this idea of a journey from what the source calls latent principles all the way to inner pillars. It's a fresh take on how to engage with ancient texts in our world today.
So, you might be asking, what exactly is BioIslam? Well, right off the bat, it's not trying to replace traditional Islam. Think of it more like a supplementary framework, a new layer on top. The whole idea is to use this process, which we'll get into, called induction, to pull out these core kind of hidden principles from the Quran. And from there, these principles get bundled together into 5 inner pillars that are designed to help us navigate the complexities of modern life.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start by introducing BioIslam. Then we'll dive into its method, this process of induction. After that, we'll decode what it calls latent principles, see how they're forged into inner pillars, and finally, we'll talk about its whole embrace of interpretation. Let's get into it. All right, Section 1, Introducing BioIslam. And the subtitle here is A Framework for the Big 5 Problems, which really gets to the heart of why this was developed in the first place. And this is a really crucial point right here. This framework isn't about throwing out tradition, not at all. It's about adding to it. It proposes 5 inner pillars that are meant to sit right alongside the 5 established outer pillars of traditional Islam. So you end up with this kind of dual structure. It's like having one set for your spiritual practice and another, complementary set specifically for tackling modern ethical challenges.
So that naturally leads to the big question, right? How in the world do you discover these inner pillars? Well, that brings us to Section 2, a process of induction. The key thing to understand is that this isn't just pulling ideas out of thin air. It's a very specific, systematic, and research-based methodology for digging into the text. Okay, check this out. It's a really clear 4-step sequence. Step 1, you start with proactive, deep engagement with the Quranic verses. Step 2, you start pulling out what are called low-level latent principles, or LPs. Think of these as the initial observations. Then, in step 3, you synthesize those into high-level LPs. And finally, in step 4, you roll up those high-level principles to form the inner pillars. The goal of this whole sequence is to unearth what the source calls the vast treasures of the Quran. Now, underneath this whole process is a pretty big philosophical idea. It's all about how we read things. On one hand, you've got exegesis. That's the dream, right? A totally objective interpretation where you're just pulling the pure meaning out of the text with no human bias. But then there's the reality, eisegesis, which acknowledges that we, as readers, can't help but bring our own biases, our own context, into the text. And here's the kicker. The source argues that for us humans, pure exegesis is basically impossible. So every interpretation we make is, to some degree, a form of eisegesis. That's a huge point that shapes everything else.
Okay, on to Section 3, Decoding Latent Principles. These are the absolute building blocks of this entire system. So let's really define these latent principles, or LPs. What are they? Essentially, they're the core concepts and values that get pulled out of the Quranic verses through that inductive process we just talked about. And they come in 2 flavors. You have the low-level ones, which are very specific observations from the text, and then you have the high-level ones, which are like synthesized axioms built from all those smaller pieces. What's cool is the source material itself gives us a visual key for how this all works. You can see it here in the quote. So let's use their example and walk through how the pillar of justice is actually built step by step. Okay, so first you go through the text and extract all these specific low-level principles. You might find one from a verse about fairness, another about equity and transactions, one about testimony and evidence, and another about the just treatment of all people. You can think of them like individual data points, little clues scattered all over the place, but all pointing in the same general direction. And then you take all those little data points, the ones about fairness, equity, testimony, and you synthesize them. You look for the common thread, the big idea that connects them all. And when you roll them up, what do you get? You get a single, powerful, high-level principle, justice. And this, right here, is where it all comes together. Section 4, Forging the Inner Pillars. This is the culmination of the whole process. These pillars represent what the source calls the maqasid al-Quran, the ultimate objectives of the scripture. So here they are, the 5 inner pillars of BioIslam. You've got intentions, compassion, justice, harmony, and potentiality.
Now, what's really interesting is that the source lays out the detailed, latent principles for three of them: intentions, justice, and potentiality. But look, compassion and harmony, they're just mentioned. The source leaves it to you, the reader, to do the work of extracting their LPs. And that's totally on purpose. It makes it clear that this isn't a passive system. It's something you're meant to actively engage with.
All right, let's wrap this up with our final section, which is a big one, an embrace of interpretation. This is where we go beyond the mechanics and get into the real philosophy behind it all, the very strength and diversity.
Now, this is where it gets really fascinating, because the source says something you might not expect. It says that every sincere student of the Quran might use this method and come up with a slightly different set of LFPs. And you know what? That's not a flaw. In fact, the source argues that's exactly how it's supposed to be, that this diversity of interpretation actually makes the community intellectually stronger. It's not a bug, it's a feature.
And that really speaks to the humility at the core of this whole approach. It's not being sold as the final, definitive answer. Far from it. Each interpretation is seen as just one humble attempt at extracting the infinite wisdom of the divine. It's a tool for the journey, not a static map with a single fixed destination.
So to wrap it all up, BioIslam offers this structured yet incredibly flexible system for engaging with Scripture. It champions the process of discovery and the diversity that comes from it, rather than pushing for one single rigid answer. And that leaves us with a pretty powerful thought to chew on. If the source is right, and that diversity of interpretation really does make a community intellectually stronger, then what happens if we apply that same principle to other foundational texts? I'm talking beyond Scripture, to our legal documents, our constitutions, our philosophy. How might that change the way we understand them?